I want to welcome everyone to our first ECI Big Ideas Seminar of 2017-18. My name is Tom Thornton. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute and also direct the Environmental Change and Management program, of which there should be a few students in the audience. Okay, they're saying they're here. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Kate Raworth. But before I do that, I just want to mention that there are other Big Ideas seminars in the series, including next week, same place, same time. Sir Crispin Tickell, who is also, like Kate, an advisory board member of the ECI and also director of the Policy Foresight program at Oxford. And the title of his lecture is Big History, Humans and Their Environment. So that's 4:15 on the 18th. And then 2 weeks from today, on the 25th of October, again at 4:15 here, Dr. Jorg Meyer-Rees, Senior Fellow to the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies at Potsdam. The title of his lecture is Transformation for All, Implementing the Agenda 2030 in Germany from a Practical Policy Perspective. So we've got 3 of these in this month, so lots to attend, and tell your friends, all are welcome, but many of them you have to register for, so do tell them to register. Okay, as I said, tonight it's about donut economics, and it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Raworth, who describes herself as a renegade, right, not heretic, economist, passionate about making economics fit for the 21st century. Her best-selling book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, has been translated into 8 languages so far, and recently longlisted for the 2017 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award.
But not shortlisted.
Not shortlisted, okay. You might be proud of that.
I am quite proud of that.
You're not a McKinsey type of economist, are you? And of course, this marvelous book is the subject of her Big Ideas talk tonight. Over the past 2 decades, Kate has made her name in the field of development economics. She has served as senior researcher at Oxfam, a co-author of the UN's Human Development Report, and as a fellow of the Overseas Development Institute, based in the villages of Zanzibar. How exotic. She holds a BA and an MSc from Oxford and an honorary doctorate from the Business School Lausanne. She has been named by The Guardian as one of the top 10 tweeters on economic transformation. So, are you a follower? Raise your hand. Oh, okay. Well, after tonight, let's see how it goes. She also serves as Senior Visiting Research Associate here at the Environmental Change Institute and is a distinguished member of our ECI Advisory Board. She is also a Senior Associate of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and an advisor to the Stockholm School of Economics. Kate has also taught for a number of years at the ECI, where I have the distinct pleasure of co-teaching a module with her called Human Systems and Environmental Change for our postgraduate students. And this is both a rewarding and challenging assignment because Kate is a very gifted teacher, as you're about to find out. No pressure. But also one who's always pushing the envelope to the next level of pedagogy and learning. And in this respect, as well as in how to think like a 21st century economist, I've learned a great deal from her. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Kate Raworth.
Thank you very much, Tom. I am so delighted to be here because for me this is the university where my economics began, so I feel like I've come full circle, but landing back in a very different part of it. Let's see if we can connect the pieces. So let me begin. Thank you to Tom for such a lovely introduction, and I've been teaching here with Tom for the last 5-6 years, and I absolutely love being part of the Environmental Change Institute. It was actually founded the year I left Oxford, so I missed it by a hair. There goes my career in a different direction, but maybe I can bring something back and enrich it all. So let me begin with the health warning, okay? Donuts, don't eat these, okay? It's not about eating donuts. They don't taste nice. They're not good for you. Doctors get upset with me because I've called it donut economics, so I have to do the health warning because I'm talking about the idea of a donut. But let me just explain why I'm here talking about donut economics. So I came to this university a little over 25 years ago because as a teenager of the 1980s, I saw a hole in the ozone layer. I saw famine in Ethiopia. I saw the Exxon Valdez spewing out its contents in Alaska, gas disaster in Bhopal. And by the end of the 1980s, I just knew I wanted to help change the world, to work for an organization like Oxfam or Greenpeace. And I thought the best way to equip myself for that was to study the mother tongue of public policy, to learn economics, and then I would be able to shape this world. So here I came to this university to study PPE, and I specialized in economics. But I was frustrated and disappointed in what I was taught because, somebody's nodding already, because the economic theories pushed to the margins the issues I cared most about. The environment, there wasn't even a paper in environmental economics, they call it. It didn't exist in my day. Social justice, I had to hunt these things out. So I did a master's, but after 4 years I walked away. My professor was saying do a PhD, and I thought, no, I don't want to introduce myself in the world as an economist. I find that embarrassing because I don't like this mindset I'm being taught. So I walked away and immersed myself in what I consider real world challenges. As Tom said, I worked for 3 years in the villages of Zanzibar with extraordinary barefoot entrepreneurs. I worked for 4 years at the United Nations. I worked for a decade with Oxfam, which is what brought me back to this city in the early 2000s. I became a mother of twins. All of these household planetary economic experiences. And it taught me that the obvious to me, which is I can't walk away from economics, because it frames the world we live in, and it has certainly framed the world the way I think. So I decided it was time to walk back towards economics, but flip it on its head, and put at the center of economics the values that I think we should be basing our societies on, and ask then what kind of mindset would get us there. And in doing this, I'm deeply inspired by a quote from a great American inventor of the last century, Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And if you want to build a new model, where do you start? Some people start with equations, some people start with words. I think actually the most powerful place to start is with pictures, because pictures can be paradigm changing. We often think they're mere illustrations on the side of academic papers, mere illustrations in the margin, but half the nerve fibers in your brain are connected to your visual cortex. So pictures are powerful. Copernicus certainly knew this. In the 1500s, he watched the motion of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy over here, putting Earth unmoving at the center of the universe, Copernicus knew that Ptolemy had it all wrong. But Copernicus waited until he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his own alternative, because he knew that by putting the sun at the center of the known universe, he was challenging papal power, questioning church authority, and deeply shifting man's place in the universe. So pictures can be incredibly powerful. What if we were to have our own Copernican revolution now, with a few concentric circles of our own that are fit for our time? So I propose to you our own 21st century compass for development. And it looks, yes, silly though it sounds, a bit like a donut. So in the hole in the middle is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials, be it food, health, education, political voice, gender equality. And we want to ensure that everybody is out of that hole. Those 12 social foundations, I have crowdsourced them from the world's governments. They are the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you could say they're the most contemporary statement of what governments around the world agree that every human being has a claim to. And of course, they're rooted in human rights. So we want to get everybody out of that hole in the middle, but, and it's a big but, we cannot overshoot that outer crust, because there we put so much pressure on this extraordinary living planet that we begin to kick its life-giving systems out of kilter. We cause climate breakdown, ocean acidification, air pollution, chemical pollution, massive biodiversity loss. So we need to find a balance between the two. And I think this is our generational challenge. This is the challenge for our generation to take on and turn the situation around. But if I'm proposing this as a compass, well, you need to know where the needles are pointing. And that's the state of humanity on our living home today. So as you can see, many millions of people, indeed billions, fall short on life's essentials. On food, for example, that little red wedge goes 11% towards the center of the circle, because 11% of people are undernourished, according to the FAO. On water, there are two indicators. One, 9% of people don't have access to clean water. 32%, 1 person in 3, has no access to what we would call a toilet. So on all of the social foundation dimensions, millions and billions of people are falling short. And yet, we've already overshot the planetary boundaries, these 9 boundaries drawn up in 2009 by Earth system scientists who say, what is it about our planetary home that keeps it so stable and benevolent for humanity? We've already overshot where they believe the boundary is for climate change, for fertilizer use and excessive nitrogen and phosphorus loading, land conversion, biodiversity loss. And they don't even know where we are on air pollution and chemical pollution. So this is the first picture we can make of our planetary home and our well-being at the start of the 21st century. And I believe our generational challenge is precisely to turn this around. This is what our children's grandchildren will know us for. Not for Donald Trump, not even for Brexit, but for this. Whether or not we were the generation that began to turn this situation around, began to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, whether we did it or not, and that indeed is the question. So what kind of transformations will it take? I first published a version of this diagram in 2012, and I've spent the last 5 years having amazing conversations with people who've approached me, saying different ways that they, in their world of work, have been using it. So I've talked with many businesses at the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. What if a business, every business drew up its corporate strategy at this table and asked itself, does the core business we're doing, not our philanthropy on the side, but the core business, our supply chains and the way we employ people, is it helping bring humanity into this space of meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet? Or, in fact, are we profiting by pushing ourselves and the planet out? And what would it mean to turn that around as a business? I've also been approached by urban designers in Sweden about 9 months ago. They wrote to me and they said, oh, we're developing a new district of Stockholm. This is about 15 minutes from downtown Stockholm. Just below that motorway, there's an area that's going to become a new suburb. And they said, oh, we're using this donut diagram as our aspirational blueprint. What would it look like to design a new city suburb that met the needs of all its inhabitants, but did so within the means of the planet, respecting the ecosystem into which we're building? I sat with them in Stockholm last week, and we sat at a table and laughed, and we said, well, no one knows what this means yet, let's invent it. So there's lots of different fields in which people are inspired by having a compass for the 21st century which can redirect their field of work. But the place that I wanted to focus my attention brought me back to my education in this university, brought me back to what happens in places like this, in departments of economics. Because I know that around the world, millions of students study economics with the belief, like me, that it would equip them with a language to change the world. And so today's economics students, even those who just do Econ 101, in fact, probably mostly just those who do Econ 101, go off and become the politicians, the business leaders, the journalists, the lawyers, the activists, trying to change the world. They are going to be shaping our planetary home through 2050, through this century. So these citizens of 2050, and some of you are in the room, I believe the problem is you're being taught economics from the textbooks of 1950, which are based on the theories of 1850. And given the 21st century challenges from climate change to extreme inequality to repeated financial crisis, this is shaping up to be a disaster. And today's students deserve an education that is fit for the times and fit for the challenges that they know is ahead. So what would it look like to transform this economic education? I believe at the heart of economics, coming back to this power of the picture as a model, the heart of it, we can tell the essential 20th century economic story through a few of its key diagrams that look so innocent. They slip so quietly into the back of your head, you don't even realize they're there, shaping the way you think. But I think like intellectual graffiti on the mind, they linger long after the words and equations have faded. And they silently whisper to us questions so fundamental that they never actually explicitly get asked in your economics degree, certainly not in my experience, of what the economy is and what it's for and how it works and who are we. So I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of the 20th century mindset that I believe these images silently whisper to all of us, whether or not you studied economics, because they shape the public debate. And there could be no better guide than this gentleman. This is Paul Samuelson. He was teaching at MIT in the 1940s. He wrote the world's first famous economics textbook called Economics in 1948. Samuelson knew the power of writing the textbooks. You know, today people are pressured and incentivized to get published in the top journals, not to write textbooks. That doesn't get you points. Samuelson knew that was where the power lay. I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties. so long as I can write its economics textbooks, he says. The best bit. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. So watch out, because Paul Samuelson thinks your mind is a blank slate and he wants to lick it. And of course, you laugh. He has licked it because his diagrams have shaped the way we all think about what the economy is. See, he was teaching it at MIT. He wanted to make it easy for his students who were engineering students, and they had to learn a little bit of economics on the side. He wrote this textbook for people learning a little bit of economics on the side. So he made it easy for them. When he drew a picture of the economy, he drew it looking like a radiator system, with water flowing into the chambers, and it goes round and round. You can see it goes through these tanks of business and public, what we would now call households. So it flows around and around. Important concept, a circular flow of income through the economy. This diagram has changed in the intervening 70 years, but only a little bit. Today it looks like this, and every economics student knows it as the circular flow of income diagram. So we have the essential market relationship between households and business. Households provide their labor and their capital. In return, they get wages and profit. That money they use for consumer spending on goods and services. So the money goes round and round, and the resources go round and round. Yes, some of that gets siphoned off. Not everything is spent. Some of it goes to banks as savings, and they turn that into investment. Well, that's not actually quite true. Little untruth in there about how banks actually work. They create money, but I'm not even going to touch that today. Some of it goes off as taxes to government, and they turn it into spending. That's also not how government raises money actually and spends money, but I'm not even going to touch that today. We've got bigger fish to fry here. Some of it goes off to buy imports, but more comes back in from exports. Okay, it's a circular flow. It's a closed system. This is the biggest picture that a macroeconomist can show you of the economy and its actors. And its fundamental problem is that though it may have usefully shown the circularity of flow, and you can talk about Keynesian demand management here, you can measure GDP here in national accounting, but it only shows us what's monetized. Oh, the blank spaces. It makes absolutely no mention of the living world. All the materials and matter and energy drawn daily into the economy and spewed out as waste and pollution. It makes no mention of the unpaid care of parents, the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, making dinner, raising the kids, doing it all again tomorrow, to make that labor fresh and ready for work every day. And it makes no mention of the commons, the place where people get together, not with the market, not with the state, but as a community and self-organize to create goods and services they value that don't show up in GDP. Well, if the biggest picture that economics can show us today doesn't include the living planet, the unpaid care of parents, and the commons, these are three of the most fundamental sources of our well-being. And they're going to come back and bite us if they're left in these blank spaces. What about who we are? That story, of course, goes back to Adam Smith. And Smith actually had a nuanced view of humanity. He knew that self-interest is powerful for making markets work, but our interest in others is essential for making society work. And he celebrated our public spirit, our sense of generosity and justice. He said these are the attributes most useful to society. But when future economists came along, they wanted to simplify and create a model of humanity to put at the heart of this emerging science. And so John Stuart Mill said, political economy does not treat the whole of man's nature in society, nor all of his conduct. It sees him as a being who desires to possess wealth. So he plucked out for the DNA of humanity that single characteristic of self-interest. And from that we have, of course, received the character of rational economic man. Now, he's never actually depicted in the textbooks, so I thought I'd draw him, because if he were, he'd have to look something like this. He would be a man, standing alone, money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, nature at his feet. He hates work, loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the real trouble with this character is not how absurdly narrow he is, it's what looking at him does to us. Because on being told that he's like us, we actually become more like him. And the most fascinating research I read shows that economic students, as they go from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, the more they learn about this character, rational economic man, the more they say they value self-interest and competition over altruism, collaboration. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become, which means there's a huge responsibility on any academic discipline that claims to tell us who we are. Because there's going to be more than 10 billion of us on this planet this century. And if we continue to imagine and conduct and justify ourselves as rational economic man, I think we stand very little chance of thriving here together. What about how it works? Well, this story, wonderful story, goes back to the 1870s when a small group of economists were desperate to make economics a science as reputable as physics. And so they looked to the physics greats of their day, Isaac Newton. This is Newton's diagram of gravity pulling a ball to rest. And so when William Stanley Jevons began to draw his diagrams, he drew them in the style of Newton, as if to say it looks like physics, it smells like physics, it must be physics. And even in their writings, he and Leon Walras, they said, just as gravity pulls a pendulum or an object to rest, so prices pull a market into equilibrium. They began to write of market forces, the market mechanism, market equilibrium. You can hear the Newtonian physics in this language. And of course, this is the beginning of the diagram that let me just see, what's the first diagram you learned in economics? There it is. Comes straight out of Jevons's desire to be like Newton. Now, the real problem with this diagram, I would say, is not simply that the way markets move isn't really fit as an analogy to gravity. If anyone who saw the 2008 financial crisis knows that that didn't look like gravity pulling a ball to rest. But the pernicious effects are much greater, because in their desire to be like physicists, and the physicists had these physical laws of motion, economists began to search for economic laws of motion. And once data began to come through, time series from a few countries, they searched to be the one to find that law. And I believe there are two such apparent laws that have profoundly shaped our politics for decades. And they both look remarkably similar. So the first one is by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. He had a little bit of data from the US, Germany, and the UK on what happens as a country gets richer over time, what happens to inequality. And he said, I think I see a pattern. That as a country gets richer, first inequality increases and then it decreases. And the next thing he said is, I wouldn't expect this. I would expect the rich to get richer, not the poor to catch up. So he tried to explain it. He made up a hypothesis. Maybe it was something to do with rural to urban migration, for which he admitted he had absolutely no grounds whatsoever. He also said, I have 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, and probably some wishful thinking. And it would be terrible if this became an unwarranted dogmatic generalization. He never drew this diagram, but of course it was drawn out of his work. And by the time the image exists, it begins to whisper to us a mantra that when it comes to inequality, it has to get worse before it gets better, and growth will make it better. Thomas Piketty's work in 2014, actually with a fuller data set and more countries, showed that actually Kuznets was right. This was what the data showed in that time, but because it was a result of a historical moment, it was pre and post-war. War destroyed the capital of the wealthy. And post-Second World War, you had the New Deal, you had the rise of the welfare state in the UK, so massive government investment. It was war and government investment that bent the curve down, not the inherent workings of the market. But the mantra lives on today, trickle-down economics, austerity economics. We have to go through the pain together. It's still incredibly powerful. Even the IMF write these wonderful reports saying we cannot get it out of policymakers' minds that this curve doesn't hold, because the image sits in our minds and holds the political narrative. And then the second one, the environmental Kuznets curve. Two economists in the 1990s, they had a little bit of data, local air and water pollution. They admitted it was only local pollution, but they said, we think we see a pattern. As economies get richer, first pollution increases, but then it decreases. And it becomes the same mantra. If you care about the environment, don't try to regulate, because first it's going to get worse before it gets better, and growth will make it better. As if like a well-trained child, growth will clean up after itself. These don't exist, these laws of motion. Subsequent data has shown when you look at a global material footprint or carbon emissions, they don't exist. The market itself does not bend this curve down, but they have been extraordinarily powerful. And they were also a jolly good justification for what became the adopted goal of economics, which is, of course, growth. This goes back to Simon Kuznets again. A brilliant man. He would be turning flips in his grave if he knew what we were doing with his ideas. Because in the 1930s, US Congress asked him to come up with a single measure of the US economy and call it national income. He did. But he said this could scarcely be used to measure the welfare of a nation. Why? He says it doesn't include the unpaid care of parents. It doesn't include the value of goods created by the community. And it's just a flow measure. It's telling you nothing of the stocks underneath. He fought to have the stock measure created too alongside it, and he lost. Because the temptation of that single number, that you can measure a country year on year, and then in the 50s when you had a comparison with the US and the USSR and Europe, you've got a horse race now. To the point that in 1960, W.W. Rostow wrote a fantastic book. I love it so much I got myself a first edition. It's called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. Smell the politics. And Rostow said that he likened the journey of an economy's growth to an airplane ride. First, you had these 5 stages. First, traditional society in which nothing much is happening. Then you get the preconditions for takeoff. You get the beginnings of a finance industry, mechanization of industry, education for labor. You get the nation touched by a certain nationalism and a belief that growth is good for something beyond itself, like a better life for the children. Then you get takeoff, where growth becomes the normal condition, and the march of compound interest will bear its blessings. Then we go through to the drive to maturity, and finally, the era of high mass consumption. Well, you can tell that this airplane ride is unlike every other airplane ride in one respect, which is it can never be allowed to land. Rostow left us flying into the sunset of mass consumerism. He knew it. He asked the question. He said, and then the question beyond, where history offers us only fragments. What to do when the increase in real income itself loses its charm? But he never answered his own question. Here's why. He was about to become an advisor to the presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy was running for election on the promise of a 5% growth rate. So Rostow's job was to keep that plane flying, not to ask if and how it could ever be allowed to land. So I show you these diagrams, many of them deeply familiar, I assume. And when I point out the blind spots, the caveats, the assumptions, the historical moments in time, they seem flimsy. But it's precisely on those unspoken caveats, the blind spots, the assumptions, that incredibly powerful stories can be built. And that's what happened 70 years ago this year. In 1947, a little band of economists met in a small Swiss village called Montpellier. And they said, we're going to write a new economic story. This is Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and we're going to call it neoliberalism. Now, the motivation was that they saw the rise of the totalitarian state in the USSR. And they wanted to push back against that because they believed deeply that if you give the state an inch, it'll take a mile. In fact, it'll take the whole damn lot. So you have to minimize the role of the state. But in doing that, their message very quickly morphed into a market fundamentalism. And they seeded it in the 1940s. They seeded it in think tanks, in university posts, chambers of commerce, political parties. It took more than 3 decades for their message to get put on the international stage. But when Reagan and Thatcher were elected right at the beginning of the 1980s, they were the first directors of this neoliberal story, the neoliberal script, and they put it on the international stage. I believe we've been living by its narrative ever since. So it's the neoliberal story of economics which stars the market because it's efficient, so you should give it free rein. It stars finance, which is infallible, so we should trust in its ways. It stars trade, which is win-win, so open your borders. And every great story has a villain, so it stars the state, which is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. These are the core characters of the neoliberal script. Others not needed on stage, but we can meet them anyway. The household, it's domestic. You can leave that to the women. The commons, as every student knows, the commons are tragic, so we should sell them off. Society, as Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society, so we can ignore that. Earth was said to be inexhaustible, so you can take all you want. And power, this is an objective, rational science, right? A positive economics. We don't need to talk about power. We can just ignore that. I believe this script has been ruling our societies for decades, and it's been driving us to the brink of collapse. You're worried about inequality? Don't try redistribution. That's so socialist. Growth will even it up. You're worried about the environment? Don't regulate. You'll get in the way. Let growth work, and it will clean it up. This story does not work. So I believe it's time for a 21st century story of economics. And of course, I think it comes with new pictures. So let me tell you that story. First, if I were teaching economics, I would start with a question that I was never invited to ask. What's the purpose of the economy? What's it for? The adopted goal of growth seemed to just slot in without ever being interrogated. But what is the economy for? I believe this century the economy is for meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. Surely that is the overriding purpose around which human economic activity should be arranged. And then second, if that's the purpose, then what's the first diagram of the economy that you'd show? I would not show supply and demand. That says the economy is the market and the market's in equilibrium. That's two untruths in one sentence. I wouldn't even show Samuelson's radiator pipes. I'd show this diagram. I call it the embedded economy. Anyone who knows ecological, feminist, and commons theory will spot that they are merged in here. So we've got the economy embedded in society and its social, cultural, political institutions, embedded in the living world, drawing in matter and materials and spewing out waste, bathed in a river of solar energy, which we would be pretty smart to harness. And the economy itself is divided into four sectors. You've got not just the market and the state. That was a 20th century ideological boxing match driven by this neoliberal narrative. You know, are you a laissez-faire free market capitalist or you're a state-loving socialist, you commie, right? And then no space in that debate to recognize actually there are two other essential forms of provisioning. The household, where we all begin every day. All that cooking, washing, caring, cleaning, sweeping, raising your kids, whether it's for your children or your parents or your siblings, your family, your neighbors. Interestingly, I think for economic students, of course, all students, you're in halls of residence, you're almost cut off from that care economy just at the moment where you most need to be aware of it. And of course, the commons, that place where people come together and organize, not with the market, not with the state, but as a community, whether it's creating a garden on the corner of your neighborhood block, or a city farm in your town, or Wikipedia online, or Linux, the world's best operating software, all created by the communities of the commons. The state has a really important role because I know that I wouldn't want to live in a society that lacked any one of those four forms of provisioning. They all have something unique about them. But I wouldn't want to live in a society that had only one of them, dominating the rest. So the state has a really important role not only to be a provider of goods and services itself, public goods, but to balance between the others, because in the 20th century, the market colonized the commons and it dominated over the household, and we need the state to play a role in that rebalancing. But also, some of the most interesting economic activity precisely happens across their borders. Today's most innovative enterprises often are working in open source design in the commons, but creating a niche market product on it. So you've got market commons collaboration, state commons, household and the market. How do we balance life and family and work? So these need a powerful rebalancing. And because we've got the economy embedded in the living world, we can ask the ecological question from day one. How large can that through flow of materials and matter be before it begins to disrupt the very life systems on which we fundamentally depend? In the middle there, drawn financial flows, because they should be a service, right? Remember, financial services, imagine that. If finance was actually a service to the economy, to the functioning of these other sectors, in service to life, what kind of financial sector would that be? Not the one we have today. So this is the first diagram I'd show. What about who we are? We're so much more interesting than rational economic man. Yes, we can be self-interested, but we're also socially reciprocating, collaborating with each other and punishing each other when they don't reciprocate. We don't have fixed preferences, we have fluid values. Let me give you one example. If I issued a survey to this room asking you about your preferences and your behaviors, and for this half of the room, the front page said it's a consumer reaction study, and this half of the room, it said it's a citizen reaction study. Research shows you will fill it in differently, because I've triggered consumer here, and I've triggered citizen here, and your different values will come forward. Just the name by which we're called changes how we respond. We're not dominant over nature. We're deeply embedded in the web of life. And of course, we're not actually work-hating. We're purpose-seeking. And the lucky ones are those for whom these come together. So this new portrait of humanity is, of course, being written. But it couldn't be written soon enough, because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. It's being written by behavioral economists, psychologists, neuroscientists, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists. We need all of these to come together and bring its richness into economics if we're going to have a chance of thriving together. What about how the economy works? Forget the old Newtonian supply and demand, because it's not like gravity. It's the wrong kind of science, the wrong kind of physics. I believe we should put systems thinking at the heart of economics. And if you never got that joke, about why did the chicken cross the road. It's actually because he wanted to teach you systems thinking. I'll just tell you briefly. You've got two feedback loops here. So you've got a reinforcing feedback loop, and the essence of that is that the more you have, the more you get. So the more eggs you have, the more chickens you get, and the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And anything in life that spirals up, 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 or spirals down, down, down is dominated by reinforcing feedback. But then over here, you've got the balancing feedback. The more you have, the less you get back. So the more chickens you have, the more try to cross the road. But the more that try to cross the road, the fewer come back. And anything in life that's dominated by reinforcing feedback, like when I talk about economics, I get hot, I start to sweat. So my body tries to cool me down with that sweat. Or if I get cold, I'll shiver and warm me up. Our bodies are brilliant at this, at keeping our body at that stable temperature, constantly balancing us, our hunger, all of our behavior. That's why we remain and survive. So most things that actually continue and persist in the world are ultimately dominated by balancing feedback. But you can understand most of the interesting patterns from your family dynamics, right? There's always somebody who likes to wind things up, and then somebody who comes as a peacemaker and kind of calms it all down again. From the boom and bust of stock markets, the rise of the 1%, the collapse of ecosystems can be best understood through the lens of systems thinking. And indeed, after the financial crash, when the models seemed not to hold any understanding of what had happened, so many people turned to the work of Hyman Minsky, forgotten in the 1970s, because his financial instability hypothesis, if you read his paper, it's written in the language of reinforcing and balancing feedbacks, the inherent instability of financial markets because of the reinforcing feedbacks within them. So we would be wise to use this as a first lens for understanding the complex, adaptive, dynamic system that is the economy and its interaction with life. That means we need a metaphorical career change for economists. Don't be a Charlie Chaplin trying to pull on the levers of the economic machine. It's not a machine, and there are no levers. I think we should imagine ourselves more like Josephine Baker here, who's watering her garden. Think of the economy as a constantly evolving, adaptive, complex system in which we can merely be stewards, but we can be effective stewards, because garden design, it's full-on work. It's digging, cutting, grafting, moving, pruning. So how should we design that economic garden? What are the principles you would bring to bear if you wanted to design an economic garden that could meet the needs of all within the means of the planet? First piece of advice I'd say is don't aim for the boundaries. Don't merely try to be less bad, do a bit less carbon emissions, be a bit less biodiversity loss, pull a few more people out of poverty. Aiming for boundaries doesn't transform the dynamics of the system. It won't get us there. I think we need to put new principles of dynamic patterns at the heart of our economies, and there are two that I think are key. Forget those old search for the laws of motion. We should become designers pursuing patterns of design. And for me, the two that we should pursue are to create economies that are distributive by design and regenerative by design. Let me say a little bit about each. An economy that's distributive by design, in the simplest terms, value created is shared far more equitably with all who help to create it. But not just merely redistributing income. I think we need to go deeper and think about the sources of wealth, pre-distributing the sources of wealth creation. In terms of so the first source of wealth is our own body, our own well-being capacity. So investing in the health and education of every person. But then asking who owns the land and the housing? Who owns enterprise? Is it employee-owned, cooperatively owned, or is it owned by shareholders who siphon off the returns? Very different distributional patterns coming out of that land, that ownership of wealth. Who owns the power to create money? Today we give it away to commercial banks. It could be run by the state. You could have community-based currencies. There are many ways to design the ownership of money. Who owns ideas? Intellectual property rights and patents and copyright, or Creative Commons licensing? Totally different distributive results according to these different designs. What does it look like in practice? Because it is in practice. Here's a housing project in Germany where families got together, they bought the land, they designed their houses, they built them together, and they inhabit those houses. So cooperatively owned and designed housing projects. This is a familiar site in this building, a community-owned energy project where the community become owners of the power to generate electricity. This is a fab lab in the US, an open space where any member of the community can come, use 3D printers, open source access, open source designs, basic machinery, become part of a global network of research and development using Creative Commons licensing goods. And here, an employee-owned company. So distributive design already exists. And for me, what makes me actually want to be an economist again is the idea that to be an economist is to be a designer. What does it look like to create the enterprise models, the design of fab labs, the access for communities to own their energy systems, to enable communities to build their housing so that we could be actually creating institutions that enable this distributive ownership of wealth. Secondly, be regenerative by design. So this diagram, through the middle of it, is the degenerative, linear 20th century industrial economy where we take Earth's materials, make it into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. And that take, make, use, lose cuts against the cycles of the living world and pushes us over these planetary boundaries, raiding Earth's sources and filling up her sinks. So we need to bend those arrows around, allowing nature to regenerate biological materials as nature does when we get out of the way, but also man-made materials like this little clicker and many things up here that are synthetic fibers should never be landfilled or thrown away. They're not waste, they're food for the next process. So we want to create cyclical economies in which they run on sunlight, that waste from one process is seen as food for the next. There is no such thing as a single-use plastic. Nothing should be made to be landfilled. That are modular by design so that you can take them apart and replace only those parts that need replacing. And that are open source so that when the materials end up in somebody else's hands, they can know what those materials are and put them back into the ecosystem of material use. Examples: in the slums of Kenya, where there have been no toilets, a group of MBA students from MIT set up an enterprise called Sanergy. They built toilets in the communities. They created a franchise system, so it's created a lot of jobs. It's distributive by design, a lot of jobs through the community. The waste is collected, it's turned into fertilizer, and then sold for farmers to put organic fertilizer on their soil. So it's closing that nitrogen loop. This is the open source vehicle. If you buy one, it comes in an IKEA kind of flat pack, a bit like that. If you know what you're doing, you can put it together in an hour and it looks like that. 100% electric, totally modular by design, and the hardware design is open source on the internet. You can see exactly how it's made, which means that anybody anywhere in the world can customize it, can become part of the globally distributed R&D team that makes this. So it's a globally distributed form of manufacturing, customization, and assembly. And here, Houdini, a Swedish sportswear company, trying to make their garments all circular by design using only wool and tencel as organic materials, recycled polyester, recycled nylon as synthetic fibers. Also employee-owned company. So there are enterprises that are trying to be in this space. Of course, it's much harder when you're the only ones there. It needs the ecosystem to make it really thrive. So where does that leave us on growth? I've talked about putting at the heart of what the economy is for, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet, the design principles of distributive design and regenerative design. What then for the future of GDP? Rostow left us flying off into this sunset of mass consumerism. And as he describes in his book, growth became the normal condition. It's structured into our institutions. It's structured into the financial system because it's driven by the single question of how do you pursue the maximum rate of return, which drives growth. It's structured into the political system. No leader wants to lose their place in the G20 family photo. But if their country stops growing, they'll be nudged out by their next emerging powerhouse. So this is a massive collective action problem. And it's structured into social systems because thanks to a century of consumerist propaganda, we've been convinced that the best form of therapy is retail therapy. How do you undo that? I don't think any of these addictions to growth are insurmountable, but they all deserve far more attention than they currently get because we need to get off this idea that the economy can grow forever. Here's why. Look to the most successful organism in the world, the successful growing thing in the world. It's nature. For 3.8 billion years, nature has been thriving, so we'd be quite wise to learn from her patterns. And this is how nature grows. Nothing in nature grows forever. From your children's feet to an elephant to the Amazon forest, things grow and then they mature and they come to thrive. My children are 8 years old right now, so their feet are growing very fast. It's incredibly expensive. But they will stop growing, and thank goodness, because otherwise they would never be able to sit at my table. They would literally not belong in my house. See, nature knows to grow and thrive. And people sometimes say, oh, but we love to see our children grow and our gardens grow. But if I said to you, I have a growth, that's different. And you'd be worried for me because I am a thriving, living being. And if you knew that there was something in me that was growing uncontrollably, this is a threat to me. Any subsystem that tries to grow forever within a system destroys the host on which it depends. So why do we not ask what it would take to enable us to have economies that don't grow forever but come to thrive? You see, today, countries like Cambodia and Ethiopia are growing at 7 to 10% a year, which is fantastic news because that growth, if invested wisely in health and education and essential services, will bring people out of poverty. They're sort of around here on the growth curve. But there are other countries that have had a century up this growth curve. And it's just too scary to ask this question about how do we mature. Now, I don't think an economy needs to go flat. I'm not for flat GDP. I'm not really interested in the exact level of GDP. Let me tell you why. We need to replace that airplane with a different analogy. So let's remember again that the economy is made of the household, the market, the state, and the commons. Only the market and the state show up in GDP. An OECD study a few years ago found that the value of household work is around 30 to 50% of the value of GDP. So you squeeze it at your peril. The commons, they try to estimate the value of trust created in the commons around 20% of the value of GDP. These things matter. Just because they don't show up in GDP doesn't mean they don't contribute to our well-being. If we want to create economies that are pursuing that regenerative design and distributive design, then what better metaphor? Now, I think it's a kite surfer. Has anyone in this room ever kite surfed? No. Oh, you have? Okay. Well, you'll very quickly see I haven't. But here's how kite surfing works. The surfer has a board, right? Imagine that kite surfer is working with the board, and the board is moving with the waves of the regenerative economy, going up and down. They're working with that transformation. But they've also got a kite overhead that's working with the winds of distributive design. So the winds are pulling and the waves are moving. How do you balance between those two? Well, they have a little bar in the middle that goes up and down. That's right, Rachel, right? Goes up and down. So the bar goes up and down in response to the winds and the waves. I think that is the metaphor we need for the future of GDP. Let me give you one example. China is investing $360 billion in installing solar energy capacity between 2016 and 2020. So that will be a great big uplift for GDP. But once that capacity is in, the cost of generating electricity falls to near zero marginal cost. So you see a big upshift and then not for GDP as a result of becoming regenerative and distributive by design. Of course, we're currently addicted because GDP growth is locked into the structure of our institutions. So this sounds a little crazy, but we've got a century ahead of us and nothing in nature grows forever. We need to learn to create economies that can be allowed to mature and thrive. And to me, I wish so many more economists were focused on this question rather than always taking growth as the given goal. So let me pull back and finish. I think we need a narrative of economics, the 21st century story, which stars Earth, because she's life-giving and we must respect her boundaries. It stars society, because it's foundational and we have to nurture our connections. It stars the household, which is core, so we must value its contribution. And yes, it stars the market because it's incredibly powerful. But how do we embed it wisely? It stars the commons because they're extraordinarily creative, especially thanks to the rise of the digital commons now. How do we unleash their potential? Now, there's a design question for economists. And the state, it is, of course, essential. So how do we hold it accountable? As for finance, it should be in service. So what would it be like to have finance that actually served society? Business is extraordinarily innovative, as many of the most exciting companies I've met have shown me. So how do we give business purpose beyond merely maximizing profits? Trade is double-edged. How do you make it fair? And power is, of course, everywhere. It's pervasive. We have to talk about it, and we have to check its abuse. I believe this is the beginning of a narrative fit for 21st century economics. And of course, I think it comes with new pictures to scrub out that graffiti, or rather paint over it, and reshape the models by which we manage our 21st household. Right? Economics means the art of household management, and ours is the era of planetary household management. We urgently need economists managing this planetary household in the interests of all its inhabitants, working with so many other disciplines, but to design the economic institutions of markets and of regulations, of the commons and the household, the state, to unleash the potential of this regenerative and distributive design, so that we can meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. If you agree with me about the power of pictures, you might like these. I've had the privilege of working with some of the world's best stop-motion animators. We've made 1-minute animations about each of these 7 ways of thinking. As you can see, they're playful, they're silly, they're funny, because I think we have to take economics out of the equations, out of the ivory towers, and bring it back from our heads into our bodies, into our hearts, and be full of wonder, into our bellies, and laugh. We need to reanimate economics for the 21st century, make economists of us all. And I very much look forward to talking to you about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for a fascinating talk. And I think we have about 20-25 minutes for questions. And we'd like to, if you don't mind being recorded, have you speak into the microphone for your question. And since I have the microphone, I'm going to ask a question, really a vocabulary question. This phrase, the economy, I learned when we read, and we had Timothy Mitchell here a couple of years ago, and he wrote a book called Carbon Democracy, and he showed that the phrase the economy actually doesn't arise until you get basically the infrastructure of oil, when what he calls carbon democracies become dependent on autocracies in other parts of the world with oil supplies, like the Middle East. And before that, you don't really have, it's a plural thing. You've got economies, but you don't have the economy. But I noticed it also coincides with Hayek and Friedman coming together. But should we get rid of this phrase, the economy? Is that part of what we need to do, to recognize diversity?
You mean you'd like us to go back to the words economies?
Yeah, I mean, is that part of the problem, that we think of it as a singular entity, totalizing entity?
Yes, it may well be. And I found myself moving when I was writing my book. Do I say here economies? Do I say the economy? And I think I sort of a bit like Elinor Ostrom saying, look, we have polycentric governance. I sort of feel a bit polycentric about economies. Of course, there are local economies. So you can have locational economies. There's the economy of the UK or of Bristol or of Bangladesh. But you can also have different types of economies. So some people much prefer to talk about the extractive economy and the generative economy. And I would say broadly, the neoliberal narrative takes us through an extractive economy, which is driven by financial extraction. So those will be in the same place at the same time, but they're different patterns. So you're picking out different patterns. But then still at the global level, in the same way that I've shown, a picture of humanity in our global household, even though we're all in incredibly different situations and vulnerabilities to this, I still like to be able to talk about the global economy, because there is, in some way, a way in which all of these national, local, and extractive and generative economies hook up. So I move between them all. What I think is a good point, though, is by creating the creation of the economy, it's a bit like in the US when the corporation gained personhood. The economy becomes a creature, and then we must feed it. And policymakers talk about, in the name of the economy, we must go through austerity, we must tighten our belts for the good of the economy. It takes on this character, and that's dangerous. I know Mars has to go off and do some household economy soon to cook dinner for his kids. And as a parent, I empathise with this. So if you have a question, go for it. Was that the wrong thing to say, Mars? I'm proud of a dad here contributing to his household economy.
Are there other questions before Miles gets his? All right, I'll start down here.
So that was wonderful, Kate. Thank you so much. I'm Shruti, one of the current MBA students. I guess my question is, I love this view of 21st century economic thinking. What does it take to shift from 20th to 21st, and how do we actually bring these different kind of approaches you've mentioned to life? And I guess my sub-question is, what are the kind of structural challenges we're facing, but also the flip side, what are the opportunities we can capitalize on, such as the fact that millennials want purpose-driven work, or consumers are buying more ethically? So I guess that's a big question. Feel free to take whichever part you'd like, but what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities to transition our economy to really be distributive and regenerative and the things you've mentioned?
Okay, great question. So I hope from the photos I showed of distributive design and regenerative design, this generative economy is already here. The seeds of it are here, right? These things are coexisting. It's small, it's vulnerable, but it's widely distributed, and people who are involved in it love it. So it's got people power behind it. And when we need to see it grow and rise up, we also need to see the extractive economy let go. So people talk about you need to be a midwife to this new economy. How can we be good midwives and help it be born and rise? How can we be good hospice workers to the old economy and let it let go? Thank you, fossil fuels, your day has passed. Can we ask you off the stage, right? How do we help them let go? And then there's disruptive innovation in between. All sorts of technological innovations that come and rise up. And do they get captured by the old economy to extend its life? Uber, Amazon, right? They take advantage of the platform technologies. Or do they get harnessed for the new economy? So platform cooperativism. And there's a really interesting strategic questions there of what are the disruptive innovations and how do we harness them for the new economy. But actually, can I just show, I didn't plant Shruti here, but she's asked something very specific. I'm going to say something about talking to companies. I've spent a lot of time talking to different companies, and some of them say, oh, yeah, that's really sad, but the business of business is business, and everything we're doing is nearly legal, and we're just going to carry on. And others say, this is our mission. Oh my God, you've drawn a picture of our mission. I love this. You know, this is what we are, this is why we created a company, this is what we're doing. So what is it that drives those two completely different views? And I sum it up in two very different mindsets that I've heard, what I call the 21st century mindset and the 20th century mindset. There's a 21st century designer, social entrepreneur, urban designer, people with sparkles in their eyes who can see this generative economy come through. They ask one dominant question in slightly different words, but it comes back to the same idea. How many benefits can we layer into the way we design this? How can we do more for the local community? How can we give more back to the environment? How can we, what else could we do? And they get excited about what else could we do, coming up with incredible ideas. But then when they want to get finance, they have to go to the 20th century mindset because it still holds finance. And it essentially asks, how much financial value can we extract from this? And time again, you hear this tension between the two. What divides those? I think, and I'm coming to this point about the structure that we need to change, because this is so important. There are not bad people in companies. There are companies with bad structures that drive good people to do things that are destructive. So, well, there might be some bad people in companies, but the majority, right? Look, this is the work of Marjorie Kelly, and it's really shaped the way I think. Every time I meet a company, whether it's really doing bad things or doing fantastic things, I ask them, what's your company purpose? So that open source vehicle I showed you, the purpose of that company, it's democratizing mobility. That's their purpose. Sanergy in Kenya, it's a safe and prosperous Kenya. It's not maximizing our market share or being the biggest provider of X. Living purpose, not a financial purpose. How are you governed? By what metrics do you judge your success? By your financial criteria or by the living impact that you have in the world? How are you networked with your suppliers, your customers, your competitors to enable this to come through? How are you owned? By your employees, by shareholders, by a family, by private equity, because that is going to determine how you're financed and what kind of finance has a hold on you. Is it short-term shareholder capitalism, which is always going to be saying, but I want more value from this? And what we see so often in companies, and here's what happened with Unilever, for example. I think Paul Pullman, the head of Unilever, he's got a 21st century vision for his company. He talks about Unilever, a sustainable living plan. He wants the vision to be over here. But the way it's financed, owned, networked, and governed is still, it's owned by short-term shareholder capitalism, which is why it almost got taken over in February by Warren Buffett and Heinz Kraft, because they're like, sorry, we think we could extract more financial value from this right now. So how do you turn all those arrows around the structure of enterprise? How do we redesign the firm? Economists shouldn't be studying the theory of the firm. They should be studying the potential for redesigning the firm, and that is so exciting. How do you design a firm so its purpose is aligned with this mission? It's governed by metrics that take it there. It's networked, its ownership, and its finance actually unleash this potential. That, to me, is the most exciting idea of being an economist. You're designing new business models that enable entrepreneurs to be financed and governed in ways that actually unleash this potential. So. And even in academia, I'm just going to add on one thing. I was in Belgium on Monday presenting this to a lot of academic economists. And one of them said to me quite casually afterwards, he said, you know, I love these ideas. I wish I could bring it into my teaching, but I'm on tenure track, so I have to be cautious. You know, people often say, oh, it's the old professors, we need to wait till they retire. This guy was 35. But he's cautious, he's on tenure track, he can't talk about this. So the incentives, not just talking about business, the incentives in academia which prevent people from adopting these new ideas, it has to be changed. We need to redesign the systemic structures in which we work if we're going to have a chance of pursuing this. Sorry, you got me going there, Shruti. But there we are.
Okay, let me stay on this side, but coming back, anybody want to defend tenure track?
Hi, my name's Stephen Hurt. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes up the road. Really enjoyed your talk, thanks. And I teach international development, so I was also waving Rosto at my students the other week, actually. I wanted to ask...
I hope you helped the book land as well.
Yeah. I got them to discuss what the problems were with modernisation theory, and they did a good job on their own. I wanted to ask, because you're really talking about the ideas, right? That's the kind of focus, the ideas and the central problems of the dominant power, the dominant ideas within economics as a discipline in particular. But ideas are rooted in material realities. They are rooted in institutions. So there's a kind of political project here as well. If we're going to change the ideas, as you were just kind of alluding to a bit in your last response, there's a political project here. So if you look at the UK political system, the political party system, no major parties challenge the idea of growth. Mm-hmm. They're all wedded still. So it's a fringe idea very much to, what you're saying at the moment.
But where's the evolution happen on the fringes? Go on,
No,
carry on. Yeah,
so
go on. Yeah.
We can't change the ideas unless it's built. We need a political economy approach to this. There's a lot of politics and power behind, and vested interests behind the 20th century view that you were just talking about.
Yes.
So it's a question of, you've done the ideas challenge, but what's the political project that we need behind that?
I have to have the answer to it.
Well, it's a difficult question, but I think without the other, you don't.
It's absolutely the right question. Okay. Sorry, I'm just joshing. It's absolutely the right question. So how do we make this happen? So I'm really inspired by Donella Meadows and her work on systems thinking. She has these 12 leverage points for intervening in a system. And she says, some of the low leverage points is like tweaking taxes, and you can change regulation, all important, but you go higher and higher up her leverage points. The third one is change the goal of the system. The second one is change the paradigm. And she says, I know it sounds unlikely, like changing a paradigm sounds remote and intangible, but actually it can happen like that in a person. If you can show somebody a new paradigm, and I believe paradigms are most powerfully told with pictures. So if you can redraw the pictures, you start to change the paradigms in individuals. Now that doesn't take the political system with you. So how do you do that? She also said, what you have to do is just stand with your paradigm. You speak to your values. You never step into the other person's space. You always speak from your space. So I'm an advocate, right? I'm teaching in this university, but I've come from Oxfam, so I'm 1 foot in both places, and I'm loving it. And it's a very exciting place to be in. So I see this work I do. This was an advocacy project, writing this book. I left my job at Oxfam to write this book as the most effective piece of advocacy I could do. And I'm part of a social movement, a political movement for change. Because I'm a mother of 8-year-old twins and working alone, I don't have a lot of time. So my strategy is to go where the energy is. So when Swedish urban designers say, hey, we want to work with you, I work with them. And I wait for people to knock on my door. I also say I wrote the book for the long-term view, so for the future student, because it makes me furious that students should turn up in this university and universities around the world and still be shown the circular flow of diagram without the living world. So I've written it for the long view, but what fascinates me is that today's policymakers, those dealing with the now, are coming. So I've already met with the Green Party in this country and in Belgium and in other countries. Labour Party are interested. I'm getting more feelers from them. I'll tell you a funny story. This is a little story about a friend of mine bought my book and she was reading it on the tube going home, and then Ed Miliband came and sat opposite her on the tube. So she sat there and like really, and he was chatting to somebody next to him. He said, okay, what's that you're reading then? And she said, oh, this book by my friend. And he said, oh, tell her to send me a copy. And she said, these things cost, But then she told me, and I sent him a copy and I didn't hear back. But then just yesterday, he put out a podcast. Somebody said, oh, you should get Kate Raworth on your podcast. And he wrote, I said, I'd be up for that. And he wrote back and said, I like the message of your book. Let's do it. So it's through these ways. I've been told John McDonnell has read my book and likes it. So I'm like, okay, let's talk. Let's have the conversations. What this does fundamentally is challenge the sort of the Keynesian pro-growth, very safe position of say the Labour Party and parties in that space. That's like, if we get growth going again, we're just oriented towards workers, towards those who aren't yet receiving the receipts. It comes clash into the head of, but how do you have this endless growth in the face of the living world? And it's, I think until now, been just too hard to take on. But I'm optimistic that Tim Jackson's book, Prosperity Without Growth, he took the great crack of you talking about an economy without growth. Are you crazy? And then the floor has been changed and there's more space for talking about this now. Also the fact that many high-income countries are facing secular stagnation. There just ain't no growth. As the IMF calls it, there's flat growth. Nice phrase, right? So some policymakers now are having to figure out, what do I do? I'm being told I'm going to have flat growth for at least a decade or two. So it's not just an aspiration, it's not an environmental issue, it's just reality. So I think circumstances making it more opportune for folks in this space to start talking with current political power. I don't know how we're going to crack it. Just, even changing incentives for professors in the university who are trying to get tenure. If we're stuck there, of course we're stuck in the whole political system. And politicians are so wary to speak of anything that's off beam, that sounds weird. They'll get slapped down by the media or their opposition parties. So everybody's cautious. Those of us who believe in this, I think we have to stand our ground, as Donella Meadows said, speak from the new paradigm. Show that it's real, show those images are already existing, this new economy is coming through, show that it's widely distributed, make the language normal, because if we build that language, it will eventually become safe for politicians to adopt. That's my strategy. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm trying. If you have any ideas or what you'd suggest doing differently, I'd love to hear.
Okay, take one more.
I'm a father of twins, so I share that burden.
Thank you very much for your talk. The question I have is, I wanted to understand when you gave an example of Bangladesh and Cambodia. So one of the reasons...
Ethiopia and Cambodia, but anyway, currently, yeah.
Oh, Ethiopia and Cambodia. And I would like to categorize Bangladesh also in the same thing, because I think they probably are in the same space economically.
Yep.
So you spoke of, so one of the reasons for them to grow as well is also because the state has reduced its power in terms of how the markets operate. So there are many companies are led to do what they feel like doing. So suppose they start growing much, much better and they reach a point where they can be prosperous enough. The state is the country is prosperous enough. How do you propose that the state increases its power on the country? And a sense,
how do the state increases
its affluence, its influence on the areas where you think the markets are dominating the households. So right now maybe it's fine because the state has to limit its role because it doesn't have resources for the growth. But once it gets there, how does it make a transition being a low influencing society, a state where a society where the state influence is not much, to a place where it has to be influencing more, so that the equitable society and all the other issues that you spoke about could be dealt with?
Okay, I think I'm understanding. Let me just whiz back. Where is it? Here we are. So you're saying, and I think you're probably right, Bangladesh is probably somewhere around here as well, right? Low-income country, it's all happening suddenly. It's what Rostow would have called the takeoff stage. It's all happening. So I wasn't trying to say here that this should be market-dominated. I think an economy that grows in a healthy way, actually, all activity will grow in all of these sectors. I would hate to see Bangladesh grow with a market and no state. That would be totally destructive for well-being. We desperately in Bangladesh need schools and healthcare, and while we're at it, let's invest in a really low carbon and distributive transport system, because you only get to put these things in once, and a distributed energy system. Bangladesh is aiming to be the first solar nation in the world. Fantastic, right? Solar power everywhere. India's now trying to run and catch up with that, which is great. So the role of the state in not only setting regulations for what kind of energy we are going to have, but also being the provider. So you'd expect this boost in monetized activity to be the market and the state, not just the market. I imagine this will be the market and the state together. And in fact, I think in many countries we should see more role of the state. The work of Mariana Mazzucato has been really influential in showing that the state actually often takes risks that the market will never take. The state takes long-term investments that the market has no interest in. It takes investments that will repay themselves not in finance, but in well-being and security and thriving society. So the state has a return on that. So I would see the market and the state, but also the commons. Make sure that as Bangladesh's economy, its monetized economy grows, it doesn't lose the commons. I bet the commons are high, right? People's self-organizing capacity is high. That's how people survive. How do you enable the state and the market to rise without squashing out the commons? And how do you protect the household? So like in the US, right, women in the US get what, 6 weeks maternity leave when a child is born? I mean, really, that is the market absolutely squashing the household. Zero now. Zero paid. Okay, so right. So and then in Scandinavian countries, women and men get paid paternity and maternity leave for around a year. This is a rebalancing. So where's Bangladesh going to go on that as the economy, the marketed economy, grows? So I hope I'm understanding the question, that I would see all forms of this working together. And of course, the key question is, how does finance, like what kind of finance is going to be dominating the drive in Bangladesh? Because will it be finance that just rewards the market, finance that actually the state puts in long, patient investment, finance that enables households? So they should all healthily come up and thrive together. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, of course, that's the idea that it should be. So I was just curious that right now perhaps be it Cambodia in terms of low wage country, or be it Bangladesh, the reason for growth is limited intervention by the state. In many cases, so I come from India. So to give you an example, let's compare India's say textile industry versus Bangladesh, which is a very labor-oriented industry. Many companies choose to be located in Bangladesh not because of any other reason, but just because of limited role of the state. They don't intervene too much. So because of which the industry has grown much faster. Now there is increase in income inequality and so many other forces. But I may be wrong, but kindly correct me if I'm wrong, but I see that many of these low-income countries are, the reason for their growth is limited intervention by the state. And the labor is which is why the labor is also exploited, and we see so many stories. So I was curious about how do they make a transition once they become prosperous?
Okay, so I would say that countries that are experiencing this low intervention by the state, as you're saying, and markets are arriving, that's a kind of extractive market that's arriving. Yeah, we can, export-free zones, we can extract all we want and nobody will get in the way with the labor. It's like what I said, business of business is business and everything we're doing is nearly legal and we just extract. You can only go so far through a process of so-called development with that extractive model, offering that extractive model to international companies. Because after a while, the lack of state investment in education, in healthcare, in systems, in energy systems, you're not going to get very far along. So in a way, you'd be leaving yourself open to merely extractive labor value and not enabling. So I think precisely if a state wants to build, and look at South Korea, which did it, with bells on. I mean, in an extraordinary way. The state invested, the state regulated, managed that, and made an extraordinary, fast and successful transition because the state was so active.
Can we take one or two more?
Yeah,
is that
sure.
okay? Okay, from this side.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for your talk. I'm actually from an environmental science background, so I'm a marine chemist. And I was wondering, has anyone done a sort of mass balance sort of thing to say, can we even get within that donut for the carbon, nitrogen cycles and all of that?
So that's a great question. So sometimes it's called the existential donut question. Does the donut even exist? Right? So if you were to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, how do you know there'd be any green space? And we're 7.3 billion people now. I think we could do it. I can't prove it. I think we could do it. 10 billion? Maybe. 20 billion? Probably not. So how many we are also is hugely important. There's a lot of things that are important. The size of the global population, and hand in hand with that, the distribution of consumption between the global population. The extreme inequality is driving a lot of this. But also governance and technology and aspiration. And as one of the ECM students that I was teaching yesterday said, luck. We need a lot of luck if we're going to come back in from here. But does it exist? Has anybody done that study? This is an area where people are beginning to explore. So some people have done studies for individual countries. They've scaled this down. Megan Cole at this university did her whole PhD on saying what would it look like to do this for South Africa, and then a region in South Africa, and then a district. Others have taken it and done a national donut images for, I think, 180 countries. That's coming out from the University of Leeds later this year. But it delights me if people from the more quantitative environmental side, I see some variables I want to play with and see how they go together. That's exactly, I think, where research needs to start going. This picture could still be critiqued. If Miles were here, he'd say, I don't agree with the boundary on climate change on 350 parts per million. We're still learning the basics of how our planet works. It's extraordinary how little we know. But we need to precisely deepen and enrich our understanding of this interdependence of human well-being and the Earth system. So if that draws you in, go for it.
Sounds like great MSc dissertation.
Yep. Yep.
Thanks, Kate. Ellie, an MBA student, picking up on what you were talking about with reorienting businesses.
Yes.
So after my MBA, I'm going back into a large corporate business.
Okay. Who's it owned by?
It's McKinsey, the
Okay.
consulting firm.
Who
And
is McKinsey owned by? Is it shareholder owned?
by partners.
By partners. Okay. So it's privately owned. Okay.
How, if you go in kind of at the bottom to middle range, have you seen anything work for what people can do at that level to start changing the conversation? Any ideas that have popped up from discussions with businesses on what should I be thinking about, what should I be doing, stepping back into that environment?
So yourself thinking how, I'm in this massive machine.
Or any of the,
any-
thousands of graduates going straight into these businesses that are fairly traditional.
Okay, great question. And actually sometimes when I speak to a more general audience, like at a literature festival, people say, okay, but what can I do? I'm a mum, or I'm a farmer, or I'm a designer. And of course there's things we can all do. And we're often told, as a consumer, yes, what you cook and how you eat, meat or not, how you travel, what you buy, but also as a citizen, and how you invest and how you divest and how you protest and how you volunteer and how you vote. All of these things we have influence. If you're a student, how you put your hand up and the questions you ask. If you're a teacher, the models you teach by. If you're an employee, the questions you bring to your employer. If you're an entrepreneur, how you incorporate your business. So, to the employee in the extraordinary machine that is McKinsey, I would start by bringing the purpose, and I would say this, but I would say, have you seen this? And and they have, by the way. And so I was asked to, at the McKinsey Financial Times Transformational Business Awards this year, they suddenly invited me to give the keynote speech. In a few weeks' notice, so clearly someone dropped out and they invited me in. But cool, I did it. And I was like, wow, I'm standing at the McKinsey Financial Times. Okay, and I just talked this. So they've seen it. And of course, they're drawn to it because, people want purpose. And some of them have children and grandchildren, and they're drawn to it. So there we get the purpose. But then you get that schizophrenia, right? Okay, we've got the purpose, but we're pulled back by this finance mission. So I would go in, if you're feeling like, okay, I've got some influence, drive the purpose. Then you could start to have some of those conversations around, read this book by Marjorie Kelly. You'll love it, right? It's called Owning Our Future, Journeys to a Generative Economy. Oh, I love it when everybody writes it down. It really transformed the way I think about business. And it was essentially that signboard I showed of purpose, governance, networks, ownership, and finance. And shows that the DNA, the way a business is designed, just determines what it will and won't do, what it can and can't do. So I would read that and then take that back into McKinsey, because what McKinsey could be, if McKinsey is inspired to do this, then McKinsey should be working with the companies that it works with to help them rethink their DNA, which is like deep corporate psychotherapy. I think, psychotherapy, like people say, oh, I go to psychotherapists, like I have relationships with all these really difficult people, I need you to help me. And as they go through the therapy, they're more like, okay, I realize it's me. And it's corporate psychotherapy. We have all these difficult suppliers and these factory managers who won't meet the rules. And the more they go through, okay, it's actually the way we're owned and we're financed, and can we transform? But that would be amazing if you, in the constellation of what you've learned in this university and what you know and the influence you have, deeply valued, young, highly educated graduate, these companies are desperate to keep people like you. And more research is coming out showing that companies that don't have values, they're losing their graduates. So they're terrified of losing the bright and the best coming through. So you're powerful. And use that. Good luck. Yeah.
We've got one over here.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Ian Curtis, indeed. Ian Curtis, local citizen. Kate, you've been incredibly rational in the way that you've talked. Today is actually World Obesity Day. And the numbers are pretty scary, with serious chunks of society quite literally eating ourselves to death. And I wonder, that sort of suggests there's something pretty tricky internally in our individual minds, our mindsets. And I wonder to what extent you've explored the irrational side of this narrative and how that might get moving in a positive way?
So I don't know a lot about obesity. I'm not immersed in that world, so I can't say anything really smart about that. I am aware that on food, this measures undernourishment, and it doesn't reflect the other half of the world's problem, which is obesity, which of course it should be, right? So it's not just about people falling short. It's actually, well, maybe you could say they're falling short on a nutritious, healthy diet, because obesity is often driven by the lack of time and the lack of availability, and you live in a street that has 8 fried chicken outlets, and this.
Really interrupting. I didn't mean how do you address the obesity
Okay.
issue. I'm meaning you are trying to sell us a new narrative.
Yes.
And yet there is a very basic need of food.
Yes.
And we are exploding out of it and literally killing ourselves.
Yes.
In that way. How are we going to engage with something as rational as this when we're stuck in an irrational desire to literally eat ourselves to death? And I'm just wondering whether you've explored. We clearly need some irrational drivers as well as some rational drivers to help us get out of that mode of quite literally eating ourselves.
Okay.
To death,
So I'm going to take the eating ourselves to death so I've often had this conversation in terms of people say, but you say we should have an economy without growth, but people want more. People deeply want more. People aspire to more. You're taking away people's aspiration. And I question that. I think we've had a century, at least, where the shape of progress has been this ever-rising line. And it goes back to a deeply orientational metaphor. And George Lakoff's work on orientational metaphors says one of the deepest metaphors in our bodies, especially in Western society, the metaphor that's used in language is that good is forwards and up. So, a child crawls and then stands up. We draw ourselves as, lolloping apes, and then we stand up and we walk. And so we see, why are you looking down? Or we're moving forwards, we've gone backwards. We use this to say good is forward and up. Good is more. So it's as if we look at just a segment of that growth curve. And we do. We only look at a segment of that growth curve. I think we have Peter Pan economies that teach us sort of, like there's the Peter Pan economy. Growth, growth, growth. Growth is wonderful. Growth is wonderful. We never get to that cancer stage of realizing, no, endless growth is not wonderful in a living system. And our aspirations and a century of consumerism has taught us to want more, that we transform ourselves by buying something more, whether it's another meal or another pair of shoes. But actually, there's another metaphor that we can go to that we also deeply know connects with our well-being, and it's about balance. And we talk about it all the time, about work-life balance. And so we can bring that metaphor through. And if you look to the symbols used in traditional cultures, they're balanced, yin-yang, Maori takorangi, Celtic double knot, the Buddhist endless knot. They're all these almost circular images with an inherent dynamism, which I find fascinating. And it's as if Western society left that and just said, no, 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 good looks like this, up, 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 up. So we need to deeply go to the roots of how we describe well-being to ourselves, away from this aspiration always for more, and recover and find the language and depict to ourselves lives that are about balance. And I know we understand it, because we understand balance in our own bodies, if we can recover it. I don't have a full answer to that, because you're asking me like the deep answer of Western society. But I think reaching into those metaphors and changing them is definitely part of the answer.
In your lecture, through my eyes at least, it was a kind of 20th century versus 21st century idea. And however, some of your concepts, I think, were directly taken from some 20th century economists. For instance, the embedded economy, which is Polanyian, and maybe market fundamentalism. So isn't it actually maybe a rediscovery of some of the economists that we have kind of neglected? And that's maybe one question. And then the second, just quickly, I think, for my eyes, potentially ignoring the idea of degrowth. So even in America, for example, if it had zero growth, it would still be consuming more than the planet can sustain.
Yes.
So isn't there, for the richest, an idea of degrowth that is even more potentially politically problematic and economic problematic? So
Great
I'd love
questions.
you to talk
Okay,
about
I'll
that.
take them in reverse order. So the second one, so remember this graph, this is not material throughput of an economy, this is the GDP. So we absolutely need some decoupling of the value of GDP and the material throughput. Whether it's relative, it's got to be more than relative, it's got to be absolute. Whether it's going to be sufficiently absolute, well, that's the whole green growth debate, whether you believe we can have green growth or whether you think it can never be green enough. But this is not the through flow of the economy. So as I showed this diagram, and if I showed you that for the UK or the US, it's absolutely clear that these economies are way over their share of impact on planetary boundaries and absolutely have to reduce their impact on so many dimensions, on nitrogen, on carbon emissions, on biodiversity impacts, footprints globally. So I'm talking about the consumption footprint. What happens to GDP? To me, that's a moot question. To me, the absolute question is that we have to redistribute so that the poorest can meet their needs and that we come back absolutely within planetary boundaries. I don't feel confident enough to say, through the extraordinary transformations that need to happen in order to make that happen, whether GDP will go up or down. The example I gave in China, well, GDP will go up and then down or not be contributed to more as a result of solar energy capacity. So you could say that becoming a regenerative economy, you'd expect GDP to go up. So I never talk about degrowth, partly because you're still talking about growth. It's growth, it's just degrowth. You're still stuck in the frame of growth. I talk about regenerative and distributive economies. I think degrowth can be misunderstood as to whether we're talking about the lowering of the resource through flow or the lowering of GDP, and these can be separated, so it can lead to confusing conversations. Your first point, you said, you know, some of these, you're absolutely right, some of these diagrams were from the 20th century. Let me just go to that, the one that captures that most. There we are. So Herman Daly, right, he was the man back in the 1970s who, so simply, little box of the economy, and he drew a circle and labeled it the environment. It was so radical, the World Bank had to take the diagram out of its World Development Report because there was no room for this. It really, that's a great story. Feminist economists for decades have been saying, hello, there's the unpaid caring work of the household. Quick little story, Adam Smith, writing The Wealth of Nations, in which he wrote this famous sentence, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer that we get our dinner, but from their regard to their interest." Adam Smith was living with his mum when he wrote this book, right? Mum was cooking dinner while he was writing. If only at that crucial moment he turned around and seen her slaving over the pots, perhaps he might have recognized the unpaid caring economy from day one, and it would not have been left out for 200 years. So it's the disregard of the functions around us. But so anyway, feminist economists for decades, commons theory, right? Eleanor Ostrom for decades. So the obvious thing is, I didn't invent this. I'm trying to bring together commons theory, feminist economics, ecological economics, institutional, behavioral, because the problem is that they're still in their silos. And you can say, you know, I'm a feminist economist and you're an institution and you're ecological. And we all go off to our different conferences and write for different journals and read different blogs. Critique remaining in these fragmented margins is never going to dislodge an old narrative. They have to be creative synthesis. You have to be propositional and bring them together. And I'll say the last word with the great quote, André Gide. Everything that needs to be said has already been said, but nobody was listening, so it has to be said again.
So you've thanked Kate, but it has to be said again. So join me again in thanking Kate for a very tour de force.